Welcome everyone to the first episode of Life in the 1990s, a series about what life was like before the advent of social media, smart technology, and acceptance of degeneracy. In this series, I will cover a lot of events that people did in the 1990s, from television to film to eating out, the works. While I will cover a lot of the good from the 1990s, I will also cover the bad. Let's start off with what many people watched long before the advent of social media: television. To me, television hit its peak in the 1990s thanks to cable TV and innovative programming. In the 1980s, cable was a huge talking point in cities and satellite was a huge talking point in the rural areas. Local TV began its decline as early as 1984, 40 years ago. Fast forward to 2024 and more people are buying antennas than ever before thanks to cable companies and streaming services getting greedy. However, cable was a hot commodity at the time. When people started ordering cable in 1984, the average cable bill was $10 a month. However, due to the demand for cable TV, local cable companies turned into a multi-billion-dollar entity going into the 1990s. By 1991, the average cable bill was $20 a month. If you ordered premium packages that featured HBO, Showtime, and the Disney Channel, you had to tack on extra fees. It was nothing compared to the 2010s when cable and satellite companies got incredibly greedy. I will address this later. But let's concentrate on the 1990s. While local TV in general was on the decline, you still had hit shows on NBC, ABC, CBS, and the rising network known as Fox. On NBC, Law & Order became a hit show in regards to the police and the prosecutors. We said goodbye to Cheers in 1993, but welcomed one of the greatest spin-offs named Frasier in 1994. In that same year, a hit medical show called ER, which stands for Emergency Room, swept the nation. Seinfeld became one of the biggest sitcoms on television since All in the Family in the 1970s. Counterculture returned to television after network executives tried to instill conservative family values with feel-good stories. The problem was that it was a failed concept. Counterculture in the 1980s was heavily censored. Whether it was women puffing their hairs and wearing leotards in public, or men wearing random checkered clothing, the 1980s was a fashion disaster. Then life lessons were censored on television until the rise of cable TV. 1987, everything changed. Counterculture returned to television when Fox Network became the fourth local TV channel. Married with Children and The Tracy Ullman Show brought back something that made television special in the 1970s: edge. Fox did not immediately take off, but it gained momentum through the years. Then the controversial episode of Married with Children called Her Cups Runneth Over contained some raunchy material. One woman would ironically change the landscape of television forever, a woman by the name of Terry Rakolta. She called for sponsorships to drop the show and have the FCC pull Married with Children off the air. Casual viewers that were used to The Cosby Show saw Married with Children and were immediately hooked. Ratings rose and Fox ironically attracted record sponsorship. This is what catapulted television going into the 1990s. While that was going on, Roseanne on ABC immediately went neck and neck with The Cosby Show in the ratings. It brought realism to struggling families that did not buy into the family value of feel-good stories. Blue-collar families didn't watch television to learn lessons on how to feel better about themselves. They watched to escape reality and get entertained. Roseanne was the perfect counter-program to The Cosby Show. While Roseanne was not as over-the-top as All in the Family, they did not hide anything. From the stress of poverty to the coming of age for young females to family members not being saints. While the final seasons of Roseanne sucked, the first 5 seasons were important in the annals of television history. Another big show on ABC was Home Improvement. While it was a show about building stuff and being macho, which resonated with a lot of tough guys, it was also a progressive show for its time. Whether it was Tim the Toolman Taylor and his assistant Al Borland educating us on how to build stuff or kids being kids, there were some surprising moments that people still talk about. Whether it was the cancer scare of Randy, Joe going through menopause, or coping with death. Home Improvement wasn't just about building stuff and being macho. It was also about life in the home and how to be a better man in the end. What a show that was. 60 Minutes had some struggles in the 1980s, but then a controversial event in 1990 brought the show back to the forefront. In 1990, Andy Rooney said something controversial about the LGBT and races. CBS feared that Rooney's comments were going to cause the network to shut down entirely, leading to a 2-month suspension. Viewers of 60 Minutes were pissed since Rooney was the reason why 60 Minutes hit number 1 in the ratings in 1979 and 1982. The suspension of Andy Rooney caused a dip in the ratings. Mike Wallace leveraged CBS into ending Rooney's suspension. Nonetheless, when Rooney came back, eyes were on the product again. 60 Minutes went to the number 2 time slot in 1990. Then in 1991, 60 Minutes was back to the number 1 time slot. Andy Rooney's segments, The Death of Harry Reasoner, and hard-bitten stories of the time was what brought 60 Minutes back to number 1. From 1991 to 1994, 60 Minutes was the main show on local TV. But Andy Rooney's suspension was what ironically brought the show back to number 1. Rooney died in 2011. Now let's go to cable television. Until 1991, Nickelodeon was an obscure TV network best known for the Canadian-produced show You Can't Do That on Television. From 1979 to 1990, this show catapulted a lot of names, including the popular singer Alanis Morissette. Another popular TV show before 1991 was Mr. Wizard's World, starring the late Don Herbert. Then the rise of counterculture in the 1990s had Nickelodeon saying, "What if we introduce a little edge to our cartoons?" That was how Nicktoons began in 1991. Shows like Rugrats, Doug, and Ren and Stimpy would launch Nickelodeon into the stratosphere. Rugrats was about the life of a baby from a baby's perspective. Doug was about the life of a preteen learning to adapt to certain situations. Ren and Stimpy was about an abusive dog and a jolly cat that get into messed up situations. The popularity of these three shows would inspire Turner Networks to create a show entirely dedicated to cartoons on cable TV. This would be known as Cartoon Network. Cartoon Network launched in 1992. From 1992 until 1996, you mostly saw reruns of old cartoons from the likes of Warner Brothers and Hanna-Barbera. We could argue that Two Stupid Dogs was the first original cartoon on Cartoon Network. Then in 1996, Cartoon Network showcased edgier cartoons. This would be known as the What a Cartoon Show. This was the reason why Powerpuff Girls, Cow and Chicken, and Courage the Cowardly Dog would be endearing in the history of Cartoon Network. A show by Seth MacFarlane called Larry and Steve would launch his career by 1999 with Family Guy on Fox. Due to the immense success of What a Cartoon, Cartoon Network was on demand because kids finally had something to watch on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. In 1997, a new program on Cartoon Network finally convinced Warner Brothers to make Cartoon Network available on basic cable for all cable subscribers. Cartoons featured some of the best shows in Cartoon Network history: Cow and Chicken, Dexter's Laboratory, Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, Samurai Jack, and Ed, Edd n Eddy. It was an amazing moment going into the 2000s. However, we have to talk about the most controversial cartoon of the 1990s, Beavis and Butt-Head. When Beavis and Butt-Head started off as a short in 1992, it was incredibly violent. Violence against animals, Beavis getting his head bashed in. Frog Baseball in 1992 became the launching point of Mike Judge's animation career. Beavis and Butt-Head was so controversial, conservative parents and Democrats in Washington called for the Federal Communications Commission to pull Beavis and Butt-Head off the air. Children threatened MTV Network. Grown people made asses out of themselves with their complaints. Beavis and Butt-Head was very violent in the early seasons, but as time went along, the violence was toned down and Beavis and Butt-Head were flanderized into being idiots. Ironically, it was people like Rush Limbaugh and David Letterman that saved Beavis and Butt-Head from getting pulled off the air. Celebrities in Hollywood found Beavis and Butt-Head entertaining. Subsequently, the people that resented the show finally accepted the show. But Mike Judge couldn't just settle for Beavis and Butt-Head. Due to his popularity, he would create a more realistic cartoon in 1997 called King of the Hill. That show was also controversial for its time because it was mocking people in the state of Texas. Much like Beavis and Butt-Head, it took a while for people to be accepting of King of the Hill. The 1990s was a very complex decade for television, but it also had several controversies. I cannot talk about all of them in detail, but there is one example. Wrestling got very edgy in 1996 thanks to the New World Order for World Championship Wrestling, then the Attitude Era for World Wrestling Entertainment in 1997. Then came syndicated television. Jerry Springer would be known for showcasing degeneracy and violence, making that worth watching. MTV Spring Break, in my opinion, was a little too hot for TV. But it was not all madness for television, as we still had quality content across the board. Game shows had a resurgence in the 1990s. The Price is Right was the #1 game show on television, averaging tens of millions of viewers a week. I would argue that The Price is Right was at its peak on television during the college era of the show, where numerous contestants were college students. It brought a level of excitement to the show that even Bob Barker would have admitted to be the best era of his tenure. The launch of Game Show Network didn't just introduce modern viewers to old game shows, but new game shows would come out of it as well. Whammy, Extreme Gong, and Lingo was what catapulted game shows again. When Ben Stein's Money was a popular game show, giving Comedy Central tremendous attention alongside the controversial cartoon South Park. The formula was to answer questions correctly, and whoever won the most money challenged Ben Stein to answer questions. If you answered questions correctly more than Ben Stein, you won the $5,000. This game show was so good, it won a Daytime Emmy Award in 1999 for Outstanding Game Show. Ben Stein and Jimmy Kimmel were the co-winners of the Outstanding Game Show host as well. But then came Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, hosted by Regis Philbin. This was the first game show to dominate local TV in the ratings since the $64,000 question in 1955. The format was that you had lifelines, certain brackets in which, if you reached the brackets, you walked away with a certain amount of money on a check guaranteed. The main rule was that if you answered the question, you had to confirm that it was your final answer. If you won, you made money and answered harder questions. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was the perfect TV show as we entered the 2000s. Television would do great in the 2000s even when social media was on the rise. But then came 2007 and it changed television forever. If you want to know the full story about 2007, I will link a video from Rumble in the description. But from the 1990s until 2007, cable television was amazing and local TV did not do too bad despite the decline at the time. Of course, in the 2010s, television went downhill incredibly quickly for two reasons. The rise of streaming services, which was considered counterculture, and cable companies getting too greedy. Like I said before, the average cable bill in 1984 was $10 a month. In 2024, the average cable bill is $220 a month. If you consider how the utility bills are, along with groceries, water, and phone, $220 a month is too much for cable TV. And considering the price hikes of streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, Max, and Disney Plus, there's your reason why local TV has returned after a 40-year decline. Bottom line, television is not what it used to be, but local TV is a bigger fixture in homes today. Television will never be the same like it was in the 1990s. Cutthroat, entertaining, and a much larger platform than television in the 1970s. Stay tuned for another edition of Life in the 1990s. Welcome everyone to episode 2 of Life in the 1990s. When I talked about television, I knew that at some point, I would talk about music as well. Today, I'm going to cover music. The explosion of cable television along with multiple FM radio stations helped platform subgenres of music that no one could have imagined back when radio was limited. But there we were going all the way back to 1991. The 1980s was a tumultuous decade economically and culturally. Economically, 2 recessions rocked America, 1981 and 1987. Censorship on television was heavy with moral values and cartoons that were used as advertisements to sell toys. Movies were used to promote checkered clothing and corny dialogue. Then there was music. Everything was so digitized in the 1980s, finding authentic music was a pain in the ass. Synthesized music hit its peak, and the performers went all out with their hair. The genre of rock was in a conundrum. Rock bands in the 1970s lost their relevance, and rock bands in the 1980s were about screaming and all that good stuff. Now don't get me wrong, there were some classic songs in the 1980s, but even people in the 1980s will admit that there were more gems in the 1990s than in their time. In the case of the rock genre, bands were more known for their hair than their music. Guns N' Roses, Winger, Poison, Metallica, the list goes on. By the time the 1990s rolled around, hair bands started getting stale. Music started getting stale mainly due to people sobering up after decades of engaging in drugs. Cocaine, methamphetamine, etc. No, I do not consider marijuana a drug. I'm for the legalization of marijuana. Anyway, 1991 was a downer year for music. While cable TV exploded and network TV was doing good, music hit a low point. What were the number 1 songs in 1991? Justify My Love by Madonna. You're in Love by Wilson Phillips. Rush Rush by Paula Abdul was probably the only mainstream song that people talked about in 1991. Even then, music was not top priority. Then it all changed when a new subgenre of rock called grunge popped up thanks to a band called Nirvana. Not only was a younger audience attracted to grunge rock, adults that sobered up admitted that Nirvana's style of rock was innovative. Before you know it, Smells Like Teen Spirit revived the genre of rock, inspiring musicians from every single genre to be more edgy with their tunes. Smells Like Teen Spirit would become number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 singles list. The era of grunge rock pretty much made the hair bands irrelevant. Then came 1992, and this is where music got very interesting. I'm Too Sexy from Right Said Fred took the world by storm. Recorded in 1991, this song had a massive impact in Europe and America. Obviously, I cannot play these songs due to copyright, but for you modern-day viewers watching, you have to listen to the song. Was it edgy for 1992? Yes, but this song was played in a lot of movies, including Grumpy Old Men. Another big song in 1992 was I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston. This song was originated by Dolly Parton in 1974, 50 years ago. However, Houston's talent brought this song to a whole different level. And I gotta tell you, listening to this back in 1993 was highly entertaining. Rest in peace, Whitney. I really can't say much about 1993, but 1994 was a huge year for music. Unfortunately, the world lost multiple celebrities. On the film and television side, we lost people like John Candy, William Conrad, Burt Lancaster, Peter Cushing, Jessica Tandy, George Peppard, and Raul Julia. On the music side, we lost Cab Calloway, Kurt Cobain, Henry Mancini, and Georgie Sifra. 1994 was a tough year for the entertainment industry, but during those times, you had some subgenres break out. Blues Traveler released an album in 1994 that electrified blues fans so much, people demanded that radio stations played their songs. So in 1995, Runaround was a huge hit on radio. So popular, the album 4 sold 6 million copies. A pretty big deal in 1995. Runaround also won a Grammy Award. While that was going on in 1994, Hootie and the Blowfish started making their mark with Hold Your Hand. Alternative rock really took off because from there in 1995, Hootie and the Blowfish would release their most popular song, Only Wanna Be With You. Boy, what a song that was. The song did more to help a man and a woman connect in the 1990s than any country song from the 1980s and 1970s. And speaking of country music, the 1990s put country music back on the map. Whether it was Toby Keith and his controversial style, Mark Chestnut and George Strait bringing entertainment to country music, or Shania Twain proving to people that you do not have to be an American Southerner to sing country. In fact, one of the greatest country singers of all time named Hank Snow was from Nova Scotia in Canada. You also had a breakout artist in Mindy McCready in 1996 with the hit song Guys Do It All the Time. She was a brilliant mind who unfortunately committed suicide in 2013. So in the 1990s, you had genres and subgenres of music to listen to, and a lot of them were entertaining. Whether you were a fan of pop, rock, country, or even jazz, you had everything. One of the biggest genres to explode in the 1990s was rap. Oh yeah, there was a time when rap was actually entertaining. Rappers from the day managed to articulate their messages about poverty, oppression, racism, and gang warfare. The two most influential rappers in the day were Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G., aka Biggie Smalls. Don't get me wrong, you had guys like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and the late Coolio. But Tupac's Shakespearean-style rap got the attention of all races. Rap was mainstream due to people like Coolio, LL Cool J, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Biggie Smalls. I know there are a lot more rappers, but these are the examples. Sadly, the murders of Tupac and Biggie left a huge void in the genre of rap that even Snoop Dogg, to his own admission, could not fill. Rap is not what it used to be, and even longtime rap fans will agree that the genre of rap is not as entertaining as it was. Another genre that struggled since the mid-1990s is Latino music. Now wait a minute, how did Latino music lose its luster if Shakira made it fun to listen to in the 2000s? Simple. A singer named Selena Quintanilla Perez. She was influential in the 1990s with her style of singing Latino music. Not only did she appeal to the citizens of Mexico, but she appealed to Mexican Americans and even white people. Oh yes, Selena was so popular in the 1990s, white people listened to her and said, this woman will be a big star. And it would come true. Selena paved the way for many Latin singers including Shakira, there's no doubt about that. Tragically, Selena would be killed by a person named Yolanda Saldivar on March 31st, 1995. Selena was 23 years old. Had Selena lived a lot longer, she could have been a huge star, being featured in movies, having a television show. Hell, Selena could have worked with another Selena down the line, in reference to Selena Gomez. Imagine if Selena Quintanilla Perez and Selena Gomez worked with each other. Finally, to the most explosive genre of the 1990s, techno music. Oh man, how big was techno music in the 1990s? Let's say that techno was as electric as disco was in the 1970s. Whether it was Daft Punk from France, Faithless from Great Britain, and the prodigy of Great Britain innovated music that brought life into dance clubs in the mid and late 1990s. However, one techno song really shook things up worldwide. You folks may know this one, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Darude's Sandstorm. Oh man, what a song that was to cap off the 1990s. Again, I cannot play any of these tunes that I mentioned because of copyright. But if you have not heard of Sandstorm, you will know why this song was #1 on multiple charts worldwide. While this song did not hit #1 on America's music charts, it had people talking. What a perfect song to end the 1990s. Sure, we had hit songs here in America like Baby One More Time from Britney Spears, Believe by Cher, Livin' La Vida Loca by Ricky Martin, or even Genie in a Bottle by Christina Aguilera. Don't get me wrong, some of these songs were great for its time, but they were not innovative like Sandstorm was from Darude. That pretty much sums up music from the 1990s. I could have talked about the cultural impact of Spice Girls, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, or other bands out there, but it would have taken too long. I could have talked about how crazy the song Loveful was from the Swedish pop band The Cardigans. That is not important, even though that was a good song for 1997. This concludes episode 2. Hope you folks will come back for episode 3. I think this one will hit close to home due to those that were alive in the 1990s. Society. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of Life in the 1990s. If you remember the first 2 episodes, I covered television and music. Those videos did pretty well as people either grew up in the 1990s or were born in the 1990s. They were able to relive the good old days. Why was society in the 1990s regarded as the last decade that mattered? Well, let's look at the dictionary definition of society and explain the generations. The definition of society is part of a community, nation, or broad grouping of people having common traditions, institutions, and collective activities and interests. Society is dictated through generations, and times do change. It can change for the better or for the worse. For context, let's go all the way back to the Greatest Generation, a generation of people born from 1901 to 1924. These were the people that went to work at the age of 11, smoked before they became adults, struggled through the Great Depression, and fought in World War II. Many of these people were unfortunate victims of the heart attack epidemic of the 1950s, an event where a lot of people in their prime suffered heart attacks from chemical exposures, alcoholism, and chain smoking, the same decade in which saturated fat and cholesterol were demonized. The 1950s was also a decade where society was so fast-paced, even married mothers with children were encouraged to go to work rather than homemake. This is where we dive into the next generation, the silent generation. This generation was the last generation that was very pro-Christian. These people were born from 1925 to 1945. They were the children that struggled in the Great Depression. They were the children that grew up in World War II. They were also the first generation to resent smoking. I know many people that were in their 80s and 90s and never smoked, which is why they aged better than their parents. My great-grandparents smoked, but my grandparents did not smoke. They were the first to realize that tobacco was an addiction, therefore a waste of money. Why were they called the silent generation? Because these people lived quietly during the Great Depression and World War II. If there is one thing that the Greatest Generation and the silent generation have in common, they ushered in arguably the most controversial generation, the boomers. Right now, we'll talk about the baby boomers, then jump right into the 90s because we know about Generation X and millennials. The boomers were the first pro-communist and anti-religious generation from 1946 to 1964. We evolved from sitcoms with life lessons to edgy comedy. The boomers were responsible for heavy metal, 420, the sexual revolution, the explosion of atheism, and the explosion of technology. Think about this. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Alan Alcorn. While the boomers were the most liberal generation of all time, some of the boomers would denounce their political affiliations in the 1970s after realizing that Democrats and Republicans were exposed to promote propaganda to fool them into the election polls. Now let's jump into the 1990s and why society began to change. We evolved from writing letters on paper to sending it in the form of a self-addressed stamped envelope to email. Now grant you that email first started in May of 1971, emailing exploded with the advent of the World Wide Web. For those of you that never wrote a letter to a friend nor a loved one, this is how it was done back in the days. Typically, you wrote letters to old people since those from the Greatest Generation did not mess around with computers. Grant you there were technologically advanced people of that generation like Ralph Baer and Gershon Kingsley. Most people from that generation relied on analog technologies to survive. That's how it was done back then. What is an example of evolution in the 1990s? Technology as a whole. Back in the old days, we got our information courtesy of newspapers, encyclopedias, and talking to people face to face. Then in April 1993, the World Wide Web became public domain, pioneering a generation of information that is more accessible. While the web was limited due to load times thanks to dial-up service courtesy of your telephone company, it was a revolution in technology that made many people and companies famous. The advent of America Online in the 1990s literally catapulted the demand for internet service. People are saying that the internet is the primary source for information and entertainment today. While that is certainly true, the internet was explosive in the 1990s. This rise of internet service would become a massive problem in the form of a dot-com bubble. The bubble would burst in 2001, causing a lot of sites to struggle mostly until 2006 when a revolution called video sharing revived interest in the internet. Another revolution that was pioneered courtesy of America Online was instant messaging, meaning you didn't have to wait days for a message courtesy of snail mail nor email. Internet lingos like LOL, meaning laugh out loud, IDGAF, meaning I don't give a fuck, or KYS, meaning kill yourself, would become popular. America Online could not last forever for two reasons. Number one, the AOL-Time Warner merger. Number two, the advent of broadband internet. With broadband internet, you didn't have to use a phone connector, you could connect with an Ethernet cable and a cable box. This meant if you lived in the city, you could get broadband internet through a cable company. If you lived in rural America, your internet service was determined through satellite. What was the next change in the 1990s? The evolution of audio cassette tapes to compact discs. Grant you that the first compact disc was made in March 1979 and first manufactured in Japan in 1982, CDs did not become huge until the 1990s for the following reasons. Number one, you didn't have to rewind just to listen to the music again. Number two, you didn't have to worry about the CD being ruined after a few plays. Number three, CDs could be preserved for longer. However, we can argue that CDs can scratch, and enough scratches can make the audio in the CD inaccessible. So much like an audio cassette, you gotta walk a fine line. Thankfully, MP3s are the most accessible ways to listen to music today. The boombox stereo system also changed. Thanks to portable MP3 players courtesy of a smartphone, people don't have to plug in a boombox for an audio cassette nor a CD. You just go on your phone and play music today. But the evolution of accessing audio began in the 1990s when we transitioned from audio cassette to CDs. Adults also evolved in the 1990s. While drugs were, are, and always will be a persistent problem in society, it is how people dealt with life back in the day that mattered. From the beginning of American history until the 1940s, people connected at church, dance halls, or town hall. In the 1950s, people connected at clubs. In the 1960s, people connected at rock concerts. In the 1970s, people connected at disco clubs. In the 1980s, people connected at parties. In the 1990s, people connected at dance clubs thanks to techno music. It was perhaps the last decade in which adults actually connected face to face. No dependence on the internet, no social media. It was a man and a woman locking eyes, partying, and having a good time. Grant you that some of those people connected all the way and having conceived illegitimate children, a lot of them won't deny that those moments were special before they had to grow up and accept responsibility. Now, I never personally connected with a woman like that in my adulthood in the 2000s, nor any other time due to my bad attitude. But hearing stories about partying in the 1990s from the Generation X adults makes for entertainment. The 1990s sadly was the first decade when people stopped going to church after false doctrines and biases in society convinced people not to join. As a person who acknowledges Jesus as the Savior, the greatest generation started dying off and the silent generation was aging tremendously. Only a few boomer parents were going to church and teaching their children about God, Jesus, and morals from the Holy Bible. Generation X adults tried to be very moral compared to their boomer parents. Most Generation X adults that I've talked to in my personal life acknowledge Jesus compared to a lot of the boomers. Many millennials are atheists, but Zoomers are the least religious people in world history. The evolution of culture, the rise of social justice, and communist influences in the world play a huge part of it. The world deems religion as racist. The world deems religion as toxic and it can promote harm among women. If you have read uncensored editions of feminist literature, you can tell how much bullshit that is. Religion helps give people hope in a time of crisis because seeking validation from the world is a dangerous concept. So someone wants to find a higher authority to cope with life and learn to be moral. Society should not dictate your life. You control your life. If you want Jesus in your life, you have a right to do so under the First Amendment right, freedom of religion. And despite objections, if you want to be a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or a Wiccan, that is your right. But if you saw what happened in the 1990s, you could tell that church sermons were not what they were in the 1930s nor the 1850s. Times have changed and society has changed. You cannot stop someone from asking about the existence of God. You gotta let your friends and family figure it out. And if you support your friend, you'll break out the Holy Bible and find answers. But that's what you did before you used YouTube, used the internet, used social media, etc. Finally, the 1990s was the last decade where you got together and had a good time. If you went to a barbecue, you talked. If you went to a picnic, you talked. You had family reunions because cell phones did not have texting features yet. Not to mention that social media did not exist. So back in the 1990s, you got together with a family in a family reunion, a wedding, or a funeral. Today, people only get together for a funeral regardless if the deceased was a religious person or not. People don't even say hello to someone on Sundays anymore. That's how society is these days. What did you folks think about society in the 1990s? Leave a comment below. In the meantime, I thank you for watching this episode. What will be the fourth episode? Video games.